Hello, and welcome to Vision 2222, the podcast where we talk with experts, researchers, and leaders in materials and manufacturing, finance and industry, energy, science and the humanities, both to know what's going on today and to peer into the future. We ask questions that inspire our guests to imagine what our world will be like 20, 50, or even 200 years into the future. And we have a lot of fun in the process. The hosts of Vision 2222 are Mikhail Gladkeek, PhD mathematician, product development veteran, leader in advanced manufacturing and digital inventory management, and science fiction author. Amanda Chady has a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology, and she mentors early-stage startups in the health sciences, helping entrepreneurs so their dreams can survive and thrive in the real world. And I'm John Marsh, an administrator at a research university where I get a ringside seat to some of the amazing discoveries that will help humanity navigate successfully into the future.
It is my pleasure to introduce guest speaker today, Chris Hare. Chris is the founder and CEO of the Storied Future and the host of the Storied Future Podcast. Using his vast knowledge, experience, and storytelling skills, Chris builds narratives that help CEOs advance their business strategies, elevate their executive brands, and transform their leadership. So, Chris, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us on the Vision 2222.
Thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
And let's just dive into it right on. The first question that I have to kick this off, you're the master of storytelling. That's your brand, that's what you do. So let's talk straight ahead about storytelling. First of all, what do you mean by that? If you could explain a little bit more. Is it different from, say, creative writing? How does it help businesses grow? And how do you position your storytelling brand from that perspective?
Yeah, I love that question. I think the way that I talk about it within the context of business. So, within academia, there's often, story and narrative can be often used interchangeably. For me, the way that I think about it is really inputs and outputs within the business world. So stories are really, one, recounting experiences that we've had, or projecting potential, talking about potential future experiences, but they're how we make meaning of the world largely, but they're the inputs into that. The way I think about narrative is the framework through which we interpret stories and through which we then translate that, and then that impacts where we head, for better or for worse. So there's a lot of talk, and there has been for a long time, around storytelling. It's important. We need to tell more stories, right? And especially, you hear startups like, well, don't just talk about your technology. What's that story that's going to grab people, right? But when you take the average person and put them in front of a blank piece of paper, and you say, tell a story, they're like, where do I start? And then, there's, plenty of frameworks out there, and people talk about, the hero's journey, and, here's how you build this arc and all of that, right? For me, where I actually start is with just human beings and how they interact with the world, and just going and sitting and talking to actual human beings, right? So if you're creating a technology that's going to solve a specific problem, just go and sit and talk to the audience who's dealing with that specific problem, and don't ask them about your technology. Just ask them about their life, ask them about what keeps them up at night, ask them about what lights them up, right? And so the way that I have defined it from a kind of marketing standpoint, but I think it's also helpful conceptually, is as atomic stories. And so the genesis of this was when I was working, I started in advertising with big tech. Then I worked at Amazon, then I worked at Microsoft. And Gartner in roughly 2015 talked about, if you want to delight these complex B2B, business to business audiences of decision makers at scale, it's all about filling the pipes with this volume and velocity of content. You need to create a content factory, right? So that's where the problem that I initially set out to solve. And there were significant quality issues, but you look at the model in a supply chain, what essentially the way they built it was, how do we strip out inefficiency and reduce costs And so they would build this factory, as it were, and in the process, everyone gets further and further away from the customer and from the audience. And so what I just naturally did, because if I was working on something that was marketing something that was more technical, I had no clue about the challenges or the audience. So I would just go and sit and talk to them and ask them questions, and then realized, they're not just giving me insights, they're telling stories. And those stories, there's something, started to see this pattern of things that were really powerful in those stories. And so today, the way I conceive of it, as I mentioned, is atomic storytelling, which is how do you go and find already existing stories that have, and they may be tiny stories, or they may feel tiny to that person, but have the energy and the matter that you can tap into to create a future with your audience, right? So my work initially was around how do you actually bring those inputs into the factory and then transform that factory. So rather than saying, hey, we as the brand have all the answers, or the marketing agency we work with, we rely on them to have all the answers. It's how do we actually crack the factory open and go and bring in those inputs from our audience. So then from there, once you have those inputs, then it's, if I just go into a pitch, for example, and tell you a story, it may create an emotion. It may get you believing like, hey, there was a shift here. But telling a story on its own is not enough. You then have to use the inputs of that story to build a narrative that will carry all of your audiences toward the future. And, we've all worked with very large or small organizations, large organizations. People generally don't like change. And then you have the status quo and what I call kind of gravity that you have to overcome. And so in my work, historically, what I've done in the corporate work that I've done is really how do you take all of these atomic stories that you gather, and then how do you synthesize those stories? Then how do you make strategic choices about those stories? Roger Martin's Where to Play and How to Win. And then how do you run experiments and learn from that? And then that creates new atomic stories, and then it goes around and around, kind of like I call it the narrative flywheel. But essentially, my goal and what I, coach people on and help them do is create what I call future gravity, which is obviously we don't know the future. We have a hypothesis about the future, but as a business, you have a business strategy that's going to lead to your desired future. So how do you translate that into a narrative that basically communicates this differentiated future that has the power to overcome all the reasons people don't want to change and don't want to work together, right? And so that's how I think about the storytelling piece as the inputs, and then the narrative as the framework that carries you there.
No, thank you for sharing. This sounds really interesting. I love the narrative flywheel. And yeah. I think you're exactly right. We don't know the future, but we can create it. And the stories and narratives that you mentioned help us do that.
Yeah. Also, your
go ahead.
Comment about the need to help people overcome inertia and reluctance to change, that really that has echoes in a whole lot of our conversations with people, because we all have that tendency to not want to seek change, but we also know that if we don't change, we die, right? So that was really interesting to hear.
I think one thing I wanted to point out, Mikhail, you're talking about the kind of creating the future. And Herminia Ibarra at London Business School writes a lot about experimenting with possible futures and possible future selves. And the work that I've been doing of late and shifting more and more into is, there's the corporate narrative, but I've been working more on leadership narrative and the personal narrative and how that, transforms the business, but also the leader. And what's interesting is, if Microsoft were to come out and say, hey, here's a bunch of different possible futures, we're going to experiment with these. You can imagine the chaos that would ensue within the business and with their investors and with their customers, et cetera, right? But at the individual level, and of course, within the business, you can obviously experiment with different possible futures. And then obviously it's a lot lower. There's still risk involved, but that has been really a great shift for me to start thinking about on the individual level, because growth is, John, when you were talking about the change or die piece, is change is really uncomfortable. And so we can think that, hey, if I step into this possible future, or I'm not going to step into this future because it's uncomfortable. But I like to think of it as like a pair of bespoke shoes. They may be the highest quality shoes in the world, and they may be uncomfortable the first time you put them on, but once you walk in them, they could be the most perfect thing, right? And so that you have to push through that discomfort to get to growth.
Right.
So I'm thinking, let's put you on the spot, Chris.
Go for it.
Tell us a story, atomic story, create some emotion and lead us to that, or show us that one of the potential futures that you see. Any example that's in your mind right now?
Absolutely. And what I would encourage you and the audience to do is to pay attention, not just to your mind, but also your emotions and your body, like what you feel or if you feel anything. Be interesting, a little experiment to run. So part of the reason almost completely the reason I'm so interested in this work is because of how personal it is to me and how much I've seen the impact of, first of all, having the wrong narrative. And so this piece is a bit heavy, but it'll get light. But in 2015, when I was working at Amazon, I nearly took my life. And if you were able to go inside my brain in the years leading up to that, what you would have heard, if there was a way to listen, was a tape playing in my head that was a narrative that I would repeat over and over and over and over again. And essentially that narrative was that I was going to die. And I won't go into all the things that happened to lead to that. But if you had asked me, why do you believe that? And why is that tape playing in your head? Well, I now know with hindsight, but I could have walked you through story after story after story, the inputs that I then interpreted to create that narrative, right? So it took me to the logical conclusion. And in the recovery process, which took years, I moved from Amazon to Microsoft, and eventually I had this amazing manager, the best manager I'd ever had. And I remember really kind human being. And I remember seeing, he had on his arm a number of Pearl Jam tattoos. And I never liked Pearl Jam in the 90s. It was cool to like them. And I tried to convince myself to like them, but I could never get into it. And then I moved to Seattle, where of course they're from. I'm like, now I really need to get into it. And I couldn't. But he told me this story. In the early 90s, he was driving across Michigan, going back to college, and got a call from his mom, or maybe a page at that time, and calls, and she told him that his dad had died. And he recounted that he turned the car around and drove 4 hours home across the state with tears just streaming down his face. And Pearl Jam, I don't know if it's on CD or on the radio, but they were playing. And I think it may have been the song Alive, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But that became his healing. And to this day, there are few things that he's more passionate about than Pearl Jam, not just at a cerebral level, but at a soul level, right? It's really brought about healing and transformation for him. So he tells me that story, and there was a curiosity that opened up in my mind. And I thought, okay, well, I'll give it a try based on his story, because I, trust him and respect him. And that's a powerful story. So I go and listen to it. And that song Alive, I remember I would put it on repeat. And I remember driving down the road with it on full blast, singing at the top of my lungs, and it became an anthem for me, right? So that starting point of, I don't even like this music, but it was a story that hit me, right? And shifted my experience. So now it's about to start getting crazy. Just buckle up. So last, I believe it was October, I wrote this LinkedIn post about that song. And I found this video of Pearl Jam from a long time ago, this VH1 video shot in South America. And Eddie Vedder, the lead singer, was talking, and he was talking about that song, and he said, it actually doesn't mean didn't mean what the fans and audiences thought it meant. So everyone looks at it as if it's this anthem of, I beat death, or I've conquered, or I'm just still here and I'm celebrating that, right? And so he tells the story and says, actually, what really happened is that when I think he was 13, he found out that his dad wasn't actually his dad, he was his stepdad. And his parents had been lying to him the entire time. And so that song was actually a middle finger to his stepdad, and it was filled with bitterness and rage towards his stepdad. But what he said is, as time went on, he saw how the audience responded to the song, and he actually came to believe what the audience believed the song meant. So he completely rewrote the narrative in his mind of what that song meant. And he said, as soon as he believed that, the curse broke, and that curse that had been hanging over him for all those years, right? So that alone, put those two together, I'm like, okay, that's incredibly powerful, right? How could it get better than that? Well, it does.
Wow, yeah.
So 2 weeks later, I say to my daughter, she's 17, said, hey, let's we like to go to the record store together. So I said, let's take your best friend, go to the record store in West Seattle. And so we get there and I say, okay, here's the deal. Everyone gets $10, which means you got to buy used, and we'll see who can get the best stash. So we go through there, we all fail. We don't get a single album. And so we said, okay, let's go to the bakery. So we're walking across the crosswalk, and it's getting dark. And I said, actually, you know what? I forgot that there's this album I wanted to look at, this Jason Isbell album. So I said, you'll go into the bakery. I'm going to run back in and get this album. So I go inside, walk upstairs, and right there digging for vinyl is Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. Like 2 weeks after that post. And I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I thought, I shouldn't talk to him. He just wants to be a normal person and blend in. And I was like, no, you need to talk to him. And then I thought, well, that's probably not him. And then I heard him talk, and I'm like, yeah, it's definitely him. So I went up and thanked him for his music, and he shook my hand. And then I just felt inside, Chris, you need to actually tell him your story, like tell the real story, right? And so I did. And I don't always have the most tact when I start stories sometimes. And so I started by saying, I never liked your music. But then I shared with him the story that I just shared with you, and how powerful him sharing that story and how powerful that song was, and how much it was a part of my healing process. And he just gave me this huge hug and thanked me. And it was like, and it is right now, you feel it right now. I mean, it was like electricity in my body, right? Where it just, for the next hour, it was just lit up with it. What was interesting, so I left there and I recorded just a quick selfie video of it and posted it. And a number of people reached out and told me that they had dealt with similar things. And then the stories that started coming in, and I'll be sharing these on a future podcast, but the stories that started coming in were absolutely remarkable. And so I share all of that. The piece where when I talk about future gravity, like I feel like with the work that I'm doing, and even like the podcast that I've created, I feel like it's not something I'm controlling oftentimes, right? It feels like I'm being propelled by something that I don't even know oftentimes where it's heading. And so I started with this focus on corporate narratives. And now actually the thing I believe in most, and what the show is becoming and what I'm becoming all about, is there's so much power in telling your story. And when you tell your story, it can change you. Absolutely. It can change a business or an industry, but it can change you and it can change other people. And so that's really what I'm all about, is how do we help people and encourage people just to tell their stories, not come up with some framework and not plan out, in that moment, talking to Eddie Vedder, I didn't have some strategy and plan and thought out narrative and story arc and all that. It's just human beings being human beings and talking. And I think that's where the magic and the energy is.
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you for sharing, Chris. I'm thinking, right, you're talking about the future gravity storytelling, creating this experiences on visceral level, basically, when you connect external events or external stimuli or things like music or poetry or movies, well, whatever moves you, whatever makes impression, you connect to what's happening with you, inside of you, your emotions, and that can change how you see life, how you see yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm also thinking about now all these different stories and narrative that we create, they're interrelated. So you have your part of the story. I'm sure that at some level, somebody else Andy Vedder would have his own part of that story, right? And it's interrelated, and it makes us all part of something much bigger. Do you meditate, Chris?
I need to more. I have in the past. I have in the past. Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I had a fascinating conversation with Jonathan Adler. So he's the head of the psychology department at Olin College of Engineering. And so he teaches engineers about narrative and storytelling. And he also teaches at Harvard Medical School. So you're at this interesting intersection, right? And he talks about the fact that stories aren't intended to be a source of truth, right? There's truth wrapped up in them, but it's really about how do we process reality. And so what I'm not saying, especially given your audience, a lot of scientists and a lot of engineers, right? The thing that I love is like, I love telling stories that are just about personal transformation. But I think what's really exciting is how you can bring storytelling and narrative together with science, with engineering, with business, and use it in a way that is, I'm not saying throw data to the wind. In fact, I would actually say just the opposite. But there's what's interesting is oftentimes if we just look at an example I love that I'll share from Amazon, when you have these large scale businesses and you're running 1,000,000 miles an hour and you collect specific data and then you look for answers within that data, there are oftentimes, if you're not going out in an addition to that data, also collecting atomic stories, talking to your customers, talking to your partners, talking to your sellers, and finding out like those additional inputs, there can be significant misses. So the one I absolutely love from Amazon was, today Amazon Marketplace, one of my podcast guests grew Amazon Marketplace from 8 employees to about 4,000. Today, I think there's roughly a $250 billion business. But what was interesting is at a certain stage, there was a belief that the entire future of Amazon Marketplace was resellers. And if you looked at the data, that's who was on the platform and that's who was selling. And that's what was growing, was people who would buy products or, buy products in bulk and then resell them, right? And so that's what all the decisions were based on. And he was encouraged to just start meeting with some folks. And so he would regularly meet with sellers just to started doing that to keep his, finger on the pulse of what was going on. And he traveled to Brooklyn and there started meeting with and discovering that there was all these immigrant families who may have been here for 2 or 3 generations. The grandparents may have come across the ocean and started a vacuum cleaner repair store. And then they start selling vacuum cleaners eventually. And then by the time the grandkids come along, they start saying, hey, we're actually going to, create our own brand of vacuum cleaner bags and then sell those, right? And then they start selling them online. So discovered through that, just going and observing and talking to human beings, this whole other category of brand owners that they didn't see in the data that they had. Right. And so there was this new data set that they needed to gather. But the only way they discovered it is through just going out and finding those atomic stories. Right. But then the flip side, you go the other direction. So that piece I always love is how do you bring the humans and the data together? But then what we were also able to do, and this is super creepy. I don't know. There's many. I shouldn't say creepy. Yeah, it's creepy. There's not many businesses where you could do this, where you have this volume and this type of data. But we actually eventually, when I created the entrepreneur storytelling program there that's still running today, we could find stories one-on-one through talking to account managers and things like that. But we asked the question, like, what would happen? Like, is there a way that we can use data and analyze the data to discover stories just based on signals within the data? And so the first time we ran a query to see if this worked after we built it, it was pretty shocking. And so it wasn't actually discovering the stories themselves, but it was looking for patterns where there were likely compelling stories. So I was going to do interviews with sellers in Las Vegas. And so I punched in all these different Las Vegas zip codes and it spit out the first 10 results. I just started looking at them one by one. And one of the first ones in that 10 that it identified, the woman was, she sold prenatal vitamins. She would donate them to women in developing nations. She was a CNN Hero of the Year, and someone had just done a documentary on her, right? And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Wow. That was like being able to talk about pulling the needle out of the haystack, out of potentially millions of people, and identify those signals, right? So it can go both ways, but it's really how do you, at Amazon, they talk about it, getting the insights from the data, but then also the anecdotes and how do you bring those together. So yeah, that's a quick example.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for sharing. These are great stories. So, Amanda.
Yeah. So, Chris, you shared a lot of really, really interesting stories, and I love everything you had to say about atomic stories. And I want to jump right in to talk a little bit more about your podcast. And I know that the Storied Future Podcast is dedicated to the power of narratives and storytelling. You work with not only CEOs and industry experts, but you also interview them. So I'm sure that there's a difference there between working with them and interviewing them. And one of the things that I really like, according to your website, which I love, by the way, is working with these C-suite executives that has the audacity of bending the future to their will. Now, I want you to tell us a little bit more about that statement. What do you mean by that? And actually, I want to frame this question around entrepreneurs because I work with a lot of startups. I help a few of them with pitch preparations. So have you worked with a lot of early stage or late stage startups? And how do you help them with bending the future to their will?
Great question. So somewhat, and obviously my background is marketing, and I love a good turn of phrase. And so that piece somewhat is definitely tapping into the vision and the ego of someone who is a founder or someone who's a CEO, right? Someone who's has that massive vision and believes they can change everything, right? And so that idea has really captured me. And then I've seen it play out over and over again in the podcast of where people put a new idea out into the world, and it could be years, decades, or in the case of NASA, when I had Steve Rader on, it's 100 years, 200 years, right? And that what happens in that lag time, and that takes this crazy audacity, right? This crazy belief, and you need fuel to propel you, right? And so that's a piece of where that comes from. Most of my experience has been enterprise. My first startup that I worked with was a network security startup that ended up getting acquired. Outreach is a unicorn startup that I worked with. And then I think a great example and with, kind of an atomic storytelling example is there's a startup that I worked with, let's see, starting the year before, end of the year before last. And it was, 50, 100-year vision. And so some of the challenges there were the founder was incredibly brilliant, incredibly visionary, but also had all of these ideas. And one of the things that you see often with startup founders is this very dogmatic belief of all the things have to happen right now because of this belief, right?
Right.
And so what I helped him with and what I've, advised others on is how do you sequence your ideas, right? Because if I come out and tell you the entire future vision right now, it might melt your mind, right? And your job right now as the founder is to get buy-in and get funding to get to the next level. And so sometimes it's very much about throttling how much you share of the narrative, right? So, but then it's about, okay, this story is incredibly complex. And so how do we build, or what, I shouldn't say story. Your vision is incredibly complex. How to get there is crazy complex. So how do we build a narrative to get there? And then what's the one story when you walk in the room that you can tell that snaps everyone's, everyone snaps their head up, pays attention, and gets what you do and where you're heading and wants to be a part of that, right? And so
right. And it's such a challenge too, because for healthcare companies, they're very technical minded engineers, scientists, and just grasping the need for storytelling, as you said, and moving or simplifying that complex vision is one of the most difficult things that I see a lot of these entrepreneurs have to deal with.
Yeah. And there's a number of ways, a number of tools that you can use. A big part of it is like when I do the narrative work, oftentimes it's kind of a mix of, human-centered design and anthropology and journalism. I worked with a regional radiology practice, and I mean, I was looking at everything from the blueprints of their new radiology facility that they built, and looking at how the structure and how they built this was connected to their values and how that manifested that. Looking at their technology partnerships, looking at how they were using data, but then also went and did a secret shopper MRI, a medically necessary MRI for the record, but to see how their front line was interpreting and manifesting that, right? But so one tool is, and the most important one, if you have customers or if there are patients you can go and talk to, or physicians, and that's what we did in that instance, is talk to all the above. And the answer was unlocked from talking to a cancer patient who had recovered and had just a really remarkable story. But sometimes if you're doing something that's so far in the future, there might not be anyone that you can talk to, right? And so in that instance, it's often like what we would do at Amazon was called, working backwards, is going to that future state. And then how do you work backwards from there? But it's also doing, at Amazon, they would call it a press release, but it's essentially, you can create characters and imagine, like, okay, what are the things that they would be feeling and dealing with, and then how is this going to shift things for them? But it's really, the technology is how, and I think that's a mistake a lot of people make, is you spend night and day for years on end working on your technology, and you get so enamored of the technology versus what's the shift, what's the future that you're creating. And so that's what I've always advised people on, is start with that, but then work backwards and show what's the reality now, what's the future, what's the gap, and then how do we get there?
Yeah, and I really like that. And so if I understand what you're saying correctly, is really using the data that they have and then finding atomic stories. I guess you could encompass that as almost customer discovery. Is that something that's similar, or you think that it's totally different? Because with startups, they usually go out, they interview people of whether or not they need the technology. Is that similar to along the lines of what you're talking about with using the data and finding atomic stories?
It is. And a really good researcher should be, doing exactly what I'm talking about. But what I see over and over again, and large tech companies do this as well, and that's more what my experience is in terms of this specific challenge, but you have a bias about the technology. And so, so I'll give you a great example from a large tech company, which we can then apply. So large tech company that is targeting small businesses, and they obviously make more money by selling all three of their products together and calling it a solution, right? So everyone wants a solution and a platform, right? So they obviously make more money that way. So then their research is biased against that. And so they go out and ask people, hey, would you like an integrated solution? Right. And I mean, you hear that question, well, of course, that sounds great. And then they also are trying to sell automation. Would you like automation? And so then all the research comes back and says, oh, small businesses, of course, want what we have. Well, then you look at their sales data, and they're now having to create marketing campaigns to get people to start using the two of the three solutions that they gave them a coupon to buy that are now sitting on the shelf, right? And so the piece that I always caution or just encourage people with the atomic storytelling piece, and actually one other piece that I'll add, is if you actually go and look at other data from outside that company on how small businesses buy, and this was at the time, but they actually viewed automation as being more expensive because they'd have to hire someone to run that automation, which is kind of counterintuitive, but that's what it showed. And then also, when you hear the word integration, you immediately think, as a small business, cost more, this is more expensive, right? And so what I encourage people to do is, yes, you can absolutely ask those questions, but before you ask those questions, just get them talking and telling their stories. And obviously, you're always going to bring your bias, but try not to even talk about yourself. Just ask them about their day-to-day. If you only ask 2 questions, the first one is, what is the thing that lights you up that you could do for 20 hours at a stretch and forget that time existed and it just flies by? What is that thing? And watch what happens to people's face, to their body, and watch them light up. That's the one. And then the flip side is, what's the thing that absolutely sucks the life out of you, or the one thing that you hate about your job that you would change, right? But asking those kind of questions and then listing, and sure, you can go to the other places, but when you come back, you should have stories that you've gathered, not just from your customers, from all of your different stakeholders. And then I would say too is, and I advised this startup last year on this, if possible, like, don't just view, like, when you're going into a pitch, don't view that as hey, this is your one shot. Like, have as many conversations or get as much intel as you can ahead of time, right? So find out if there's somebody who's getting you into that room, go and talk to them and say, not only who's going to be in that room, but how can I make you look good? And who are the people, what's the makeup of the people in the room, and what are the types of stories that would resonate with them? What's the type of narrative? What do I steer clear of, and that sort of thing? Because you're not walking into a vacuum.
These are remarkable tips. I actually love them. And I'm sure that our viewers or anyone listening that is an entrepreneur or an early stage founder, that they would find this remarkably helpful. So thank you so much, Chris, for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's okay, is it okay if I share? Because I think it's important to have one practical example, if that's okay.
Of course, yes,
Yeah.
yes, we would love that.
So with this founder I was working with last year, and this is actually how I met Esteban, who you had on previously. He actually saw this narrative and pitch that I created. It came through the pipes, as it were, at Chevron. And he remarked, like, okay, I saw this narrative and I need to meet whoever created this, which was really high praise, really, really cool.
Is it online somewhere?
No, it's not. It's not.
Okay.
But so what was interesting is the goal was really how do we recapture all the plastic that's burned or put into the ground, or burned and put into the air or put into the ground. And so you immediately get to this, there's this very big vision, and you're looking and seeing and visualizing, all the companies, the supply chain, what happens, where there's visibility, where there's lack of visibility, where there's incentives, where there aren't incentives, right? And so you can immediately go to, okay, here's how we're going to solve this. And you can talk about that. But then also, if you're talking about waste to energy, there's a ton of emotion that's wrapped up in that. And then there are players who are also tired of, getting thrown under the bus, are trying to make a difference in the world. Some are, some aren't. But there's a lot of conflict that you could potentially be walking into, and a lot of people who are saying that they're going to solve things, but oftentimes those things might not work within the context of the environment or the world that we live in, right? And the way that businesses are set up, right? So in this particular case, we absolutely showed the macro view, but what we discovered through the process and the story that really unlocked it was really what actually unlocked the founder's strategy, which was there was someone that had worked within his family's business for his entire career, retired, and then and he was a delivery driver, and all his investments went away when the economy crashed. And so he went and started driving an oil truck. And so my client was driving through town one day and sees this guy driving this oil truck, and it hit him like that's not okay, right? Like that future that he had planned went away. And so what was interesting is, and it's slipping my mind whether this happened before this guy retired or if he came back and did this. But what was interesting is when they would deliver their products to restaurants, they had a limited number of SKUs that they could sell. And those SKUs accounted for, so a restaurant would have 50 cents of discretionary spend, and only 5 cents of that went towards their category, right? So one day this guy delivers their products to this restaurant, and the restaurant owner says, hey, can I buy some toilet paper from you all, a pallet of toilet paper? Well, they didn't sell toilet paper, but the guy says, sure, I'll do it. So he takes a risk, buys this pallet of toilet paper on his credit card, ended up thankfully getting reimbursed, sells it to them. And then he realized, wait a second, when I drop these products off, the truck is completely empty. Or when I'm delivering, there's not a lot of product in the truck. I could actually make this a lot more efficient and fill it up. And if I move into these other categories, I now have 250,000 SKUs that I can sell. And then that opens up, I think it was a 9x multiple, so instead of 5 cents, there's a potential of moving to 45 cents, right? So that story starts with this really human piece of not only, hey, this guy, lost his retirement, but part of it is because of the system and the economics of it and the way things are set up. And so the founder wanted to not only transform, how do we recapture the plastic, but how do we also transform this so that it's good for everyone, right? And then
Right.
not only can you fill the truck up on the way there, now that the truck is empty, you can fill it on the way back and have a way to recapture the plastic and bring it back upstream, right? So that story then becomes the thing that grabs you. And at the same time, it's also what unlocked the model that carries the whole thing through.
That's remarkable because just from that story, I felt that, a lot about life or having any sort of revelation or light bulb moment is actually in the act of doing. So many of us, probably like me, I'm like a thinker, always planning and thinking, but you don't get stories from planning and thinking. You get stories from doing or action. So I think that, with him and making those deliveries and with the trucks, and he was able to grab hold of that, and you can find atomic stories from actually getting out and experiences. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. As I was preparing this morning, that almost very similar thing hit me. I was like, wait a second, that takes the weight off of having to create a story, right? Like stories happen. And so it's being open and Charles Goodyear, when he invented vulcanized rubber, it looked like an accident, right? I think he spilled chemicals on a wood-fired stove and created it. And detractors could say, well, that was an accident. You didn't actually create that. And he said, no, actually, I've been looking for it. I've created the environment and I've been running experiments. And if I wasn't looking for it, when it happened, I wouldn't have seen it.
Right.
Yeah, that's a story of serendipity that people fall into that trap all the time of thinking, oh, well, it was just an accident. But there's this quotation, Chris, that you may be familiar with. It's attributed to Louis Pasteur, and it is, chance favors the prepared mind. And so you have to be ready. Yeah, you can have an accident, but if you aren't ready to notice it and to understand how important it is, then it doesn't go anywhere. So it's not just having a fortunate accident, it's being able to recognize it. And there are lots of stories. My favorite one, because I live in the Smalley Curl Institute practically, is the discovery of the C60 molecule, or buckyball. And it's about a bunch of scientists getting together to study something, and then by accident noticing that what they're doing is creating these molecules of 60 carbon atoms. And they had been doing this exercise with carbon to study some aspect of space dust, but they completely threw away what they were worried about with space dust and concentrated on this appearance of a novel molecule. And it's all about being ready for it. So what you're describing with your people is exactly that.
I love that. And I think as you're talking about that, what hit me too is this is where I think it's really important, especially for founders who have that vision that grabs them or that they're obsessed about, right? There's also we have to have a community approach and an other approach where it's very much, how do we take our vision off of ourselves and really think about how can we be tuned in to what's going on with other people. So I think that's really key, not only to serve other people, but also just to pick up on those signals and see those happy accidents that often aren't accidents. They're part of what we help create.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to this train of thought. This highlights the importance of this multidisciplinary thinking and multidisciplinary research. And we talked about it in one of our previous episodes, when you have people from various backgrounds, rather than just a very narrow experts looking at solving one very specific problem, you come up with something, but something unexpected. But through this multidisciplinary view, somebody can notice, you can use it here, you can use it somewhere else. There is a different problem that nobody ever thought about, that thing that we just discovered could solve. And I've seen this in the past, and Jonathan, you're talking about the very similar thing. And the ability to be observant and notice that and build that connection, weave that thread is very important.
Absolutely. I think and I've had people challenge me before. So when I worked with this radiology practice, one of the partners said, well, how can you help us? Have you ever done anything in radiology before? Right. I said, no, absolutely not. But that's actually to your advantage, because I'm able to pattern match across industries. But I'm coming from outside your field. And I absolutely agree with you. There's having that mix of scientists and artists and people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds is what gives us, because that's what our audience is as well, right? There's this incredible
Right.
diversity, and that needs to be represented in our stories.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Well, and diversity leads into this next question set. But first, I'd like to just say that it sounds to me, Chris, as if a lot of what you're doing is you get people who know they need help with something, but they may have been so tunnel visioned on their own technology or their own company that they don't know how to really reach the audience and the full customer set. So they need to go beyond that sort of overly inward focus. And your podcast has an incredibly diverse set of guests, and then so you've had a lot of opportunity to learn from them and your guests. Can you share some of the sort of themes that cross this whole oeuvre of your work, that are themes that maybe surprised you that come from it, or learnings from the whole experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that was most surprising to me and has absolutely transformed me and shifted my trajectory was, I knew this was my gift going into it because people have told me this over and over again, and I've seen the power of it. But like my zone of genius is creating a space where people tell the story they won't tell anyone else.
Okay.
And oftentimes, even when I'm not digging, it's not that I'm necessarily digging for it. What I've been told is there's something about me where people just want to tell me stuff, right?
Yeah.
And where the place where I was like, whoa, there's something special and crazy going on here was interviewing the CEO of Logitech. At the time, Bracken Darrell. He's since moved to another company. And the question I asked is, he gave this speech in 2007, when he was the president of Braun. And he gave this speech about this coming design revolution where companies would undergo this shift across 3 stages, where in the 3rd stage, every single part of the company would be based on, not be driven by engineering, but would be driven by design thinking. So then he gives this speech, and then he goes looking for a company that's failing so badly that the only way out is his narrative, and that was Logitech. So they're bleeding money, they're laying people off. And if you look at his resume, phenomenal resume, and ultimately, I think he 4x'd them in 5 years. They've won over 250 design awards, won the Edison Award, and everything looks perfect, everything looks polished, right? And he's been on all the media, all the business TV shows, etc. So I asked him, I said, what was that like for you in the beginning? You're laying people off and going through all of that stress. How did that hit you at an emotional level, or what was that like for you? And his initial answer, I rolled my eyes internally, thankfully not externally. His initial answer was, I don't remember the bad times. And so in my mind, I thought, oh, that's, so cliche. And what he said next was literally like a gut punch for me. Came out of nowhere. And he said, I think it goes back. The reason, he said, I don't remember the bad times. I think it goes back to when I was 9 years old. My dad left. My mom went off the rails and had like 4 car accidents inside of a year. She would just unload all of her problems on me and my siblings like we were her therapists, right? And at some point down the road, I'm imagining this is a few years down the road, just given how mature this is, he said to her mom, I need you to imagine you're standing on a beach and you have a stick in your hand and you draw a line in the sand behind your heels, and nothing behind that line defines you anymore. The only thing that has power over you is the future. I was just like, whoa, where did that come from? Right? Out of nowhere. And it opened up this conversation where I talked about my mental health journey, and he started coaching me and telling me exactly, reinforcing that the past has 0 power over you, right? And the future is the only thing that you have, and the only thing you should be looking at, right? And I feel that in my body even now. And what was remarkable is afterwards, their head of comms reached out and said that it was the most powerful interview that she'd ever heard on his leadership journey, and asked to make it part of their employee onboarding. And so
Wow.
that was the first thing where I was like, whoa, there's something here. And then it kept happening over and over again where people would tell me these remarkable stories and say, I've never told anyone that story before. So where that has led is, and I still do the corporate narrative work. I built Microsoft Worldwide Energy's narrative last year. And that's still a part of the work that I do, but that's that magic that's been happening in the podcast has really taken me on pivoting into this intersection with leaders of effectiveness and human-centered skills and values, right? And there was a study that was done. The data came from Spencer Stewart, the executive search firm, Spencer Stewart, and then Herminia Barra wrote an article in Harvard Business Review with her colleagues called The Leadership Odyssey on the fact that it's no longer enough for leaders to just be effective. They also have to blend it, as I said, with those human-centered skills. And so the work that I'm pushing into even more now is coaching CEOs and founders and helping them find that inner narrative and rewrite it if necessary, that yes, will increase their effectiveness at work, but actually will transform them and then help them to show up as that authentic version of themselves that the world needs, right? So that's the piece where, when I talk about my own future gravity, I had no clue that I would end up here with the show and where it's led. And then starting to bring academics on and learning about the research backing up what I've been doing has been absolutely remarkable, right? And so now my mission that I didn't have when I started the show, my mission is to create a future where leaders are celebrated, not just for what they've accomplished, but for how they accomplished it, who they took with them, who they became in the process. And obviously the narrative and the story are vital for getting there.
Wow, that is really powerful. It's so easy when we have some sort of technical education to think that really you can let the numbers make your decisions, but that's so obviously not true. You have to have the human part of it as well. In a sense, it seems like part of what you're describing is for these leaders, they have to peel off some of their armor. They have to make themselves vulnerable enough to then be able to access those human leadership capabilities.
Yeah, and that's a good point, John, because a lot of these CEOs, there's an impression that they come with large egos. So by Chris mentioning that he has a gift for them to open up is quite remarkable, because it's sort of like creating a space for people to share emotions, some or memories, some of them good, some of them bad. So it's really remarkable, Chris, that you're able to do this and then use the aspect of storytelling in order to bring that out to an audience.
Well, thank you. And it was interesting when I interviewed at Amazon, so this would have been, let's see, I think 2013, the director there, and he's the one that came on my podcast eventually, who went on to become the VP. I was intimidated, but I didn't know how intimidated I was supposed to be according to everyone else within the organization. People were terrified of this guy. And he asked me one of his interview questions, and he's the, Chicago MBA, McKinsey, all the things, all the resume, et cetera. And he asked me how I was going to replace myself with a robot. And I mean, I'm a copywriter at that point, right? And have absolutely no clue. And so while I'm coming up with an answer, I just start pantomiming as if I'm a robot, and I start talking in a robot voice while I'm trying to come up with an answer, And I'm like, I don't know, Pete. And and so obviously I end up getting the job, and people said, "You did what in your interview?" And so the funny thing, he wasn't mean at all. He was a brilliant business leader, best business leader I've ever worked for, but he was an automaton. And so going along, fast forward, and he went through this remarkable transformation, and he ends up coming on my podcast. And after the podcast, he becomes the exec chair of FTD, the, I think, 100-plus-year-old flower company. And they had hit a wall. And so private equity brought him in to turn it around. So he comes in as a board member. And then in January of last year, there were challenges with the leadership within the company. So they pulled the CEO in seat with 5 days notice, and then parachuted Pete in as the new CEO with a new strategy, layoffs, et cetera, right? So next to no one knows who he is outside of the executive leadership team. So he used the podcast to help earn trust with the board and the employees and their florists, et cetera. So that obviously wasn't in the plan, but he used it for that. And then I coached him a little bit in the first week or two on how could he translate his MBA speak into a language that people could understand. And I'm not taking credit for this, but he ends up turning them around, leading their most profitable quarter ever, leading a merger, and then handing off to a new CEO all inside of 6 months. So wow. I did this follow-up call with him just to get a short video snippet testimonial. And it ends up turning into this impromptu podcast where we just went. And, this is on my website. And he talks about the fact that, sure, that was remarkable. But he said the thing that he found most powerful was how hearing his own story is transforming him. And as a result of that, and I told him exactly what I shared with you about, hey, this is who I saw you as, and this is how people saw you, as this automaton. But you've gone through this transformation where it's clear you love people and you care for people and you want to bring out the best in people. And so he's gone through that transformation. And so that's the piece that just absolutely lights me up, is for people to see that. And then, looking at the research that, I talked about Jonathan Adler before, his research shows that with this cohort of mental health patients who were resistant to therapy, they went through this narrative program, and the research showed that if you write a narrative that you don't believe, you write a narrative about the future, you don't believe it, but you start to live it out as if it's true, it actually transforms and can transform your mental health, right? And so that piece really grabbed me. And that's the work that I'm seeing with CEOs, is the people I'm coaching have been highly successful and may have all of the degrees, may have incredible success, but they're also trying to figure out, like, okay, but what's the story that I tell? That's maybe what they come to me for. But then what they discover in the work is actually like, hey, I can actually figure out what my internal narrative is, and I want to manifest, like, I want to bring about my purpose in the world, or just be an integrated version of myself who's the same at home as I am at work, as whatever, based on my narrative.
It's almost as if you become a spiritual leader or guide, spirit guide.
Yeah, I've been called part therapist, part a number of other things.
Right, yeah.
And I just have a quick side story, Chris, about your robot story. So I was on my way here. We're at a hotel right now, and we were having a conversation with my daughter about etiquette and eating, and just general how she should hold her spoons, fork, and so on. And she just turned to me and said, "Why does it matter? In the future, robots are going to be feeding us anyway." So in her mind, she's like, "Well, we can talk about that on your podcast about whether or not robots will be feeding us." So in her mind, she feels that she's not going to need the skills of proper eating habits or etiquette, because robots are going to be doing it for us. But that was just a side story.
That's amazing.
Let's continue on this conversation about changes that we see today and trends. So what do you see that's happening today that's changing us as humans, and how could you progress those trends into the future and think about long-term future, what our horizon is 200 years from now? And if you could, it would be great if you could try to create a story around it. What do you see in the future? Where does it go? What is the story of maybe humanity overall, or that specific trend that you see, or specific people with specific problems? Move us there, please.
Yes, I will attempt. So I think going back to, mentioned Esteban before, who you've had on, there's what I've kind of termed the false religion of the infinite computer. But it's this idea that just AI and then quantum and then whatever the next thing is going to save the planet or save us, et cetera, right? And it's obviously, there's so many pluses, but there are also minuses. And so I think, and you just look at, within big tech companies, the narratives around AI is just, it's this gold rush, and it's just, we just have to get there, right? But when there are also things that are often unseen, where there are impacts to individuals to relationships, to community that either are unseen now, but they're felt, or will be, kind of make themselves known down the road, right? And so what I'm currently seeing in my circles is this massive rise of desire for purpose and meaning, and a desire for human connection, and also just feeling the pain of, there were a lot of challenges going on before COVID, but then that isolation has grown that much more, right? And so I think my caution with kind of going back to that kind of false religion of as I term it, of, hey, technology is going to save us, is the future I would like to see created. The future that I would like to see is a human first future, and one where absolutely what we're doing right now, having this conversation, we can only do because of technology, right? But a future where humans are that much more enabled to connect with each other, to inspire each other, to listen when we're hurting, et cetera, right? And you look at, there's, I'm blanking on his name, but a neuroscientist who talks about the fact that, if a kid has attachment issues, that was me growing up, and your brain is wired a certain way because of the way that your parents interacted or didn't interact with you in those early formative years, your brain can actually be rewired by an empathetic person who's listening and leaning in and reflecting in their face back to you that what you're saying is resonating, right? And so that piece of that human connection and that human brain to human brain connection, or you look at there's a professor at I believe Princeton who's done MRI research on storytelling and what happens when I tell you a story, or when I tell you a list of facts. This is a little tiny part of your brain lights up, but when I tell you a story, this huge part of my brain lights up and this huge part of your brain lights up, the same part, and it's almost like your brains are melding, right? And so for me, I would say, and even when I was talking about creating avatars, right, I think of that as something that can be helpful for people, but also not ideal. Like for me, what it always comes back to is, how can we help people become more human and create more human connection with people and more in-person human connection? Because I don't think that's something that machines will ever be able to replace.
No, this is beautifully said, Chris. It's been a topic of a couple of episodes as well for us, when people brought up that the human connection is absolutely paramount for us as species, as organisms to grow. But I have two things, two questions, and I think I'm risking maybe episode number 2 or extending this for a few hours. It could be pretty deep. So two questions. What would you say to a phrase that I've recently read? You talked about the meaning and purpose and meaning of life, right? So the quote that I've recently seen is the meaning of all of it, the meaning of life, is the context of that is a story that we tell ourselves that makes us comfortable with who we are and what we do. There is no meaning. There is no meaning in a sense that in the objective sense. There is a meaning for us when we create that story and it becomes part of us. So that's one thing. And the second question I had, listening to your story about the future, human connection. Yes, we as humans, to challenge that, some people are talking about device-independent life, and life as a process which is basically information, which doesn't have to be biological. It can be device-independent information. And in that sense, if you're talking about AI or robots or whatever, other things, how information could be organized, that is also life, and that could be the succession for us humans as a stepping stone going forward. So what would you say? These two things.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one. And I think I know, going back to Brandon and Esteban, I've had some conversations with them on that. And I think they're Yes. And this is way outside of my I'm way outside of my depth, way outside of my depth here. But you look at the way that plants and animals communicate with each other, right? Like I think where you're heading with that is there is a different realm, like a different world or a different future where it's actually deeper connections to each other. That's, to your point, that's not device dependent, and deeper connection to nature and to the planet. Am I hearing you correctly with that?
And it doesn't have to be the nature and the planet. If you can take it even further and say that it's all about information. So what are the different ways that information can be organized?
Yeah.
And then you can say, well, my AI, whatever it is, it's a way to organize information. You could use biological systems to do that, but you can use other systems to do it. You can have a star that organizes information in a certain way, and that becomes then device-independent life that can progress through the universe.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I'm experiencing right now is there's this one leader that I'm working with, and talk about inputs and outputs. We did the workshop that I do, and we do 360 interviews with people from across his career and things like that. And the number of inputs is extraordinary. Like we could literally, and it hurts my brain just trying to organize all of it, right? And so I look at that, and this is overly basic and simplistic, but just that alone, having the ability to organize that in ways that I would never think about. But it also is something that, like, I would love to have a future where I'm actually freed up to be able to just engage with him about those inputs versus the organization of them, and in a way that, and then also like, how do you, yeah, I don't know. I'm struggling a bit on that one. My brain's a bit toast at the moment. So it might be a part two if you want to cut that.
That's what I'm thinking, right? It's so deep, and we can take it in so many directions.
Well, and I'm going to interrupt here too and say it just occurred to me that the power of storytelling, which obviously Chris is using for the force of good, is very easily turned into a force for evil. We look at what has happened in our society and people taking on false narratives, believing them in the face of actual evidence to the contrary, and then they continue to pursue goals that are actually destructive for society. And this, you can look at things like the Flat Earth Society, where it's maybe a small enough group of people that it's not that dangerous to society, but it is definitely a thing that it's an example that shows just how far off of the edge people can go if they believe in a narrative at their gut level that is entirely false. I don't think that's something that we can really address in this particular episode either, but it's sort of, I felt compelled to mention it because it's something that can be used to really destructive levels.
Yeah, there's someone you may want to have on. Her name's Charity Wright, and WRIGHT, and her expertise is false narratives, and her background is cybersecurity. But then, and China is her expertise, but looking at the impact of false narratives and how they spread. So that could be a really interesting conversation for you.
Yeah.
And then the meaning of life. That's a whole nother
Yeah.
conversation.
Meaning of life. But don't you know, it's 42.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a narrative you're telling yourself, John.
That's right, of course. Go, Mikhail. You're back to you.
No, it's I'm back to my first question. What do you think about that quote, Chris? That the meaning is really a story that we need to create for ourselves, that narrative that will make us comfortable with the context of who we are, where we are, and what we do.
Yeah. So, and Jonathan Adler's work focuses a fair amount on this. Is that we create, to your point, we create these narratives that get us through and have to work for us, right? And then there's these meta narratives that we have as a society. And, for example, the one he gives of fighting cancer, right? And it's this battle. And he said, that may be helpful for some people, but for the person who has terminal cancer, that does absolutely nothing for them. In fact, it's harmful. Mm-hmm. And you feel guilt. You feel guilt because that doesn't work for me. At the same time, And this is a much longer conversation, but I grew up in a Christian faith and then had a crisis of faith. And that's something that I've grappled with a lot. But what I've seen is, especially when people hit a certain stage in life, and I think what the science shows is that we become a lot more aware of or curious about or try to formulate our own personal narrative more. Like, I think once we hit in our 30s, if I'm recalling correctly. And then when you hit 40s and 50s and 60s, I'm seeing more and more this desire, not just for the rational, but also for the spiritual, and however people define that, right? And it is interesting, like if you look back at the Enlightenment, all of a sudden, okay, it's just about the rational. And the stories that I'm seeing and what people are telling me is just there's more and more of this desire to figure out if there's meaning there, and also to have these connections, but also to have an impact for whatever reason, right? Whether it's, oftentimes it's legacy, like how do I want to be remembered? But to your point, Mikhail, around the narrative that makes us feel good, sometimes it's, I see people that are, hey, I've done some pretty awful stuff in my life, I need to make up for it, right? Other times it's like, hey, I just want to do good in the world. And so it's this whole range in there. But yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. But it connects to the power of storytelling and creating narratives.
That would be the perfect like media training answer to give. You ask the question about the meaning of life, and I say that's a big question. You're like, yes, it's a big question. Or like my wife says, I'll tell her this big idea that I'm excited about, and she says, well, that's an interesting idea, and then doesn't say anything else. I'm like, okay, thank you. I know exactly what that means.
John?
So we've sort of talked about the future and the need for moving to more human-centered approaches, even as we also think about how we would project ourselves into the future kind of in silico, which is one way of describing what Mikhail was talking about. But let's get really crazy. Do you think actual time travel is possible? And if so, is it only forward or only backward? Or can you go in both directions? And what about the paradoxes of traveling into the past? What if you had a chance to take one trip, either forward and backward, and where would you go and why? But first, is time travel possible?
I don't think it is. I wish it were possible. It's odd. There's certain things in my life that were some of my darkest moments, or some of the biggest, most painful memories. And so I've often focused repetitively, to my harm, on willing that I could travel back there,
Yeah.
And just thinking like, man, if I just think about this hard enough, maybe it will happen. Right.
Yeah.
But then I look at the fact of, if you just went back and changed one thing, obviously the good parts about where I am most likely wouldn't be happening. Right. Or wouldn't have happened. And then I also look at the part about my work that I love most. Like, I wouldn't be able to do that had I not experienced that pain, if that makes sense. I'm planning on getting a t-shirt made that's black t-shirt, big white blocky letters on it, and says, follow your passion, but the N is missing. And because everyone, loves talking about follow your passion, but the root word in Latin means passio, means to suffer. And so the thing I love and what I find with people that are doing impactful work is what's the thing. Todd Henry's an author who talks a lot about this. What's the thing that you're so committed to that you're willing to suffer for it, right? Whether it's the technology that you're working on, or the relationship, or the difference you're trying to make in the world. And so that's the past. Like, absolutely. I mean, if I could travel anywhere to the past, I won't go into specifics, but it would probably, I don't know. That's a mind bender. It would definitely be pretty far back though. But again, who knows where I would have ended up. But if we're talking about the future and where I would travel, I don't know that I would travel to the future, honestly. Unless age is not a factor and I could go far beyond where my lifespan would be. The future kind of the aging part, I would say, scares me. I would say, kind of obsessed with, because of the work that I do, and love the future from that sense of thinking about possible futures. But I do like the kind of post-device world that you were talking about. It would be interesting to go there and see that. But again, that would mean that I'm kind of old. So I'm not sure about that.
Well, don't think about that. Imagine there are no boundaries. So if you could just magically transport yourself to million years, 10,000 years, would you want to do that? And what would you expect to see?
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to conceive of 10,000 years out, but I love the premise of this show in 200 years out. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. I think the thing that I would be looking for is, I mean, immediately, because of what I do, is how do we interact as humans, and is that better or not, and how do we tell stories, and do we have more connection or do we have less than now? But what I would want and hope to see is, because I think there is kind of that crisis that I was talking about that people were experiencing before, for wanting more human connection. So that would be my hope, is that that's absolutely so. Hopefully that's a decent answer.
I
think it's
but if we want something, I'm being too, I need to throw off I need to get outside the box a little bit. If you saw my logo, it's a hare on a hoverboard.
Yeah. Right.
So that idea of that dream, that I haven't had it since I was a kid, but that dream where you're flying, right? That would be, with a hoverboard or without, that would just, that would be worth that would be what I would want to see. That, for sure, flying through the air with no airplane around you. That's what I want.
Well, and I've been meaning to ask, since you have the hair, quite naturally because of your name, as an idea and a logo, do you make room in your business for tortoises?
It's funny. I had Aaron Mitchell on, so he was at Netflix. He was the architect of their initiative to take 2% of their cash and put it into banks that were able to then loan to Black-owned businesses that were having difficulty with accessing capital. And his story was really remarkable. But his whole, if you read Wired magazine, he talks about, he's a jazz musician, and so he talks about how that was his greatest jazz solo. And it struck me, and I asked him about that. I'm like, it kind of struck me as arrogant. But then once he explained to me how a solo works, is it actually is all about the ensemble, and it's all about the people across generations who you've learned from and listened to and whatever. So it's really about a community thing, right? But the book that he was writing, because he's someone that self-described as a tortoise, and his book is called I Might Be the Tortoise. So he said, we need to have this episode be called The Tortoise and the Hare. And it almost was, but then it would have made the episode about me, which it wasn't. So I'm definitely, I actually really like, and that's something I've told him a number of times since then, is that I actually have a lot to learn from the tortoise and from slowing down and being more methodical. So yeah, absolutely room for the tortoise.
Right. Yeah. When I thought of that at first, before we started our recording, I thought of it as a joke, but it's actually because of, your clear use of narrative devices, mythology. It's all part of how we make sense of our worlds. So, Chris, if you had one or two sentences that you wanted to leave with our listeners, what sorts of thoughts would you leave them with?
It's very similar to what I say at the end of my podcasts. Absolutely tell stories about business. But what I say is tell your story, because when you tell your story to other people, it has the power to change you and to change them and to change the world or to shift the future. So that piece of pushing into that humanity and telling your own story is so key.
Well, really appreciate talking with you. This has been quite mind-opening for me, and I love having gone through these questions with you and seeing where they lead us. All three of us have, I think, gained a lot from it. Obviously, Amanda's going to follow up with you. You may get some more customers, which is good.
This has been an absolute blast. And I actually just got booked for a speaking engagement in August at a large conference. And you all might have shifted my future, because I was planning on giving a different talk, but after this, I might be doing the atomic storytelling talk because
Awesome.
I'm so excited about it. So
That's amazing to hear.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, so how would people get in touch with you? How do they find you?
yeah, my website, they can find me on LinkedIn at Chris Hare, Hare, or my website is thestoriedfuture.com, THESTORIED future.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and we will look forward to seeing more of you and your podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vision 2222, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Our YouTube channel is called Vision 2222 Podcast, all one word. We're also on Podbean at vision2222podcast.podbean.com. Again, Vision 2222 Podcast is all one word. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vision 2222. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. Please also comment, and we'll do our best to respond.